With Canada set to legalize recreational cannabis on October 17th, they have now made a weird move by signing on to a renewal of the US led war on drugs. So, this from the Globe and Mail. The Trudeau government's decision to sign on to the declaration, released by the White House on the sidelines of US President Donald Trump's first attendance at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, contradicts Ottawa's previous skepticism of Washington's drugs war at home and abroad, and comes just weeks before cannabis legalization in Canada. The statement reiterates the primacy of international narcotics control efforts with an emphasis on criminalization and the role of law enforcement. It does not contain the word human rights. Advocates for harm reduction and against mass incarceration have been trying to inject a rights-focused approach into international drug policy. Now, this seems crazy. So, as I said, Canada is just about to legalize recreational cannabis. They are moving towards a different approach to the war on drugs, moving towards legalization and regulation of drugs, as the war on drugs is clearly a complete failure. So why exactly has Canada signed on to this? Well, this gives you an indication as to likely the reason. Former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark said she believed that both Canada and Mexico, which also signed the declaration, even though President-elect Andrés Manuel López Obrador has repeatedly said that the war on drugs has failed and he will pursue new policy, likely have signed on reluctantly, held hostage by the North America Free Trade Agreement talks in Washington, over which a critical deadline looms. Quote, "It's clear that a good third of the signatories have already moved along the path to regulation. They're being hypocritical and sucking up to Trump. It's pathetic and painful," said Maria Catui, a commission member from Switzerland. Ms. Clark added, quote, "It's giving in to bullying and extortion, and it's outrageous." Completely agree. Now, as said there, the reason Canada likely signed on to this is because they want to pick and choose their battles. They don't want to be fighting with Trump over NAFTA, and now also starting a fight by not signing this declaration over the war on drugs. So both Canada and Mexico, despite having moves towards a different approach to drugs, have signed on to this. So ultimately, does it really mean anything if they don't stand by it? If their actions, like Canada's actions on legalization, or what Obrador has been saying with his different approach to drugs, does it really matter if they sign on to this UN declaration if their actions say otherwise? I don't really know. But it does show the lack of leadership, at least from Canada, on this issue on the world stage. So 130 countries altogether signed on to this, and 63 did not. So dissenters included major U.S. allies like Germany, Norway, and Spain. Now, there was a semi-defense of Canada and Mexico in this article, and I also understand this point of view as well. So this from Nick Clegg, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Britain, called the Canadian endorsement a diplomatic decision rather than a policy one. Quote, "I guess there was a judgment to be made, which from my days in government I can understand why they did it. If you're fighting lots of battles at once, you probably decide which battles to choose," he said. But he said that Canada's actions speak louder than the statement endorsed in New York. Canada clearly also thinks that a new approach needs to be tried out. So, essentially what I just said. Because Trump has created all these new fires, like this fight on NAFTA, it then puts Trudeau in this spot where he feels like he needs to sign on to something like this UN declaration on the war on drugs as a way to not hurt the negotiations with NAFTA. So, from that perspective, I understand why they did this, especially if it doesn't necessarily translate to actual policy on the ground in Canada. This declaration, signing on to it, doesn't really mean Canada has to follow any new guidelines on the war on drugs. It seems like just really an empty gesture. And as I said, since Canada is legalizing cannabis on October 17th, they clearly are taking a new approach to the war on drugs. But look, if this was a Hillary Clinton presidency, this would be a whole different discussion. Because Trudeau would then be freed up to push the U.S. administration on drug policy. He'd be freed up to then not sign on to this this UN declaration on the war on drugs and actually lead by example and show that, look, science and the science and the data show that more criminalization is not going to solve this issue. We need a new approach. and Trudeau would be able to make that case on the world stage in front of the US. But because Trump is such a child and is creating all these new fires, Trudeau has to sort of be the adult here and give in on certain issues that hopefully ultimately won't actually lead to won't lead to real policy on the ground. So on one hand, I understand it. I understand why Trudeau did this, but at the same time, I mean, you're letting Trump be the leader here. That's what's happening. Because he is the child, because he is creating all these fires, everyone around him has to sort of, tread quietly and be kind to him and make these sort of gestures where otherwise they wouldn't have to under any other presidency. It's sort of this mixed bag where even though Trump is the child here, he's also sort of the leader. Because he is the child, other countries are afraid to act the way that they would normally act because of the way that Trump may react to them. It's fucked up. And really, it makes Trudeau look weak on the world stage, even though ultimately the policy on the ground, at least with cannabis legalization, is the right way to go. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button below and consider becoming a patron at therationalnational.com/join. You get some extra content, but also, most importantly, you help support me in continuing to produce these sorts of videos.